I'm Erwin Raphael McManus, and this is the Genius of Podcast. Today, I'm talking with Joshua Fields Millburn, who is one of the co-founders of the Minimalist movement across the United States. He has 2 Netflix documentaries, he has 4 best-selling books, and we're going to talk about the subject of his newest book, Love People, Use Things, because the opposite never works. So will you welcome with me the genius of Joshua Fields Millburn. Josh, it's so excited to have you. And I know it's a little strange to be called a genius, but just for clarification, you didn't come to me and say, hey, I'm a genius. Would you interview me? I came to you and I wanted to talk about really the genius that has so clearly developed inside of you. We met as you and Ryan, your co-founder of Minimalism, have really began to spread this incredible message of living a more simple life.
Yeah.
And I just was really fascinated, not just about what you guys are doing now, but what your journey was to get you to this place.
Sure.
So we can have a starting point for everyone who is meeting you for the first time.
Okay.
Give us a short explanation of what minimalism is and why it matters to you.
I think we have to go back to the beginning, really. You know, I was born in Dayton, Ohio, and I grew up really poor. Food stamps, government assistance, but also a lot of the sort of trappings of an abusive household. Drugs, alcohol abuse, schizophrenia, mental illness, depression, all of that sort of in the household. And for whatever reason, I correlated the discontent that was going on in our home when I was growing up with a lack of money, a lack of resources. And I think that's partially true. You know, we didn't have enough. And so I assumed that if I just went out and made a lot of money, then I would be happy. In our society, we call that success. Right. It's all metric based. It's achieving something. It's the acquisition of trinkets. You know, the average American household has 300,000 items in it, which would be fine if it was making us happier, more content, more tranquil. Unfortunately, it seems to be doing the opposite. And so when I turned 18, I went out and I got a sales job and I started climbing the corporate ladder. So I skipped the whole college route, and I learned that, oh man, if I make $50,000, maybe I'll be happy. Well, that didn't work. So I needed to adjust for inflation. And so maybe it was 75,000, or maybe it was 6 figures. That was happiness. Well, it never really worked. And so then I started turning toward things. I felt this void inside of me. Well, I didn't know at the time the void had sort of been created by advertisers and corporations to make me feel inadequate, make me feel like I'm not enough. So I acquire things that they're trying to sell me, basically. And so by my late 20s, I had sort of achieved everything I ever wanted. 6-figure salaries, a big house with more toilets than people. You know, I had all the stuff to fill every corner of my consumer-driven life. I was living the American dream. But then 2 things happened to me. My mom died and my marriage ended, both in the same month. And you know, those 2 events really forced me to like look around and start to question what had become my life's focus. And I realized I was so focused on success and achievement, and especially focused on the accumulation of stuff. And so yeah, I might have been living the American dream, but it wasn't my dream. It was kind of my nightmare. I was working 70, 80 hours a week to fulfill someone else's dream, and it wasn't in line with my own values. In fact, I didn't know what my values were. I didn't know what was important. And those 2 events forced me to sort of look around and ask, what is actually important in my life, in this life?
So what is really important in this life, Josh?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about what's important, we have to figure out what do we value, right? And so I think we all have the same fundamental needs for food and shelter and clothing and education and vocation.
Kind of Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah. But beyond that, I would look at what I would call structural values. And I think that's what makes life interesting and different for each of us. If you build a house, your structure might be different from mine. It doesn't mean you're right and I'm wrong. Sure. The problem is when I try to build a house based on everyone else's structure, right? And what's happening is all of a sudden everything that is urgent or important to other people now becomes urgent or important to me. And if I have 100 friends and everything is urgent to them and important to them, but I don't know what's important to me, well then I'm going to get dragged in 100 different directions. And so this question came up when I first started simplifying my life, as I started trying to identify what was important. It was, how might your life be better with less? And it was the question we started our last film with. And the reason that question was so important is I never even stopped to consider less. In our culture, we always consider more, right? It's, how do I acquire more of this, more status, more friends, more food, more alcohol, more imbibing, whatever it is? How do I get more of it, and how do I get it as quickly as possible? In fact, it's even in the fabric of this country, the pursuit of happiness. Well, I discovered that happiness can't be pursued, it can only be uncovered. The pursuit of happiness is actually a problem. It's a chase, and every chase is a sort of attachment that leads to suffering in a way. And so I was chasing happiness all along when it was just right here. It was buried under a whole lot of materialistic clutter.
All right, so you said earlier that this vacuum was created by advertisers. So I want to press in and go, was it created by advertisers or was it capitalized by advertisers?
That's great. Yeah, it was widened by advertisers, is perhaps another way. So as human beings, we're told that we are consumers by advertisers, right? And in fact, that's how corporations, I ran 150 retail stores back in my corporate days, which I know is really ironic with the whole minimalism thing now. And so I was a director of operations for 150 retail stores, and we referred to our customers as business customers or consumers.
Wow.
And that's partially true. You and I, we all need to consume some stuff. I buy my clothes, and we're sitting on a couch right now. I'm not against stuff. Consumption is not the problem. Compulsory consumption is the problem. Being told that you need to buy things, consumerism, the ideology that buying things is going to make you happy, is a problem. And you're right. We all tend to feel some sort of void, and part of that void is because we're told that we're consumers. And you know what? If you tell me I'm something enough times, I'm going to believe it. And yes, I am partially a consumer, but fundamentally, I'm a human being, and human beings are creators. Ever since we were sketching on the walls of caves, we have been creators. It's just that recently, especially in the last 100 years, it's almost as though we've forgotten about that need to create. And I think that is ultimately what is creating that void inside us.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that we are inherently consumers in terms of the moment we are born, we start consuming oxygen.
Yes.
We start eating, we start drinking. In fact, my daughter Mariah has a baby, and she demands to eat. She demands to drink. She demands to be changed.
Yes.
She has a lot of demands. So right now, she's almost like 100% a consumer.
Right.
She's not making any contribution to society. And
yes.
all she is a taker. But one of the challenges, even in American society, is we have this issue with obesity in our culture.
Sure.
And it's because if we consume without creating, we become like still water. We become like a Dead Sea.
Yes.
We're supposed to consume to create.
Oh.
And we're never supposed to consume more than we create, or we don't create the space for healthy consumption.
Yeah.
And so if you're working out, you have to have protein, you have to have energy, you have to consume.
Yes.
And in fact, a lot of athletes who are just absolutely jacked when they're professional athletes, and then they retire, they keep eating and consuming at the level at which they ate when they were world-class athletes.
That's
and
right.
Then they become so overweight. And I think what you've identified is a consumption without creation that goes outside of physical health, but actually more almost like a psychological, maybe even a spiritual health, where we're trying to find our meaning by what we're consuming without actually creating out of that energy.
That's a great point. Yeah, I actually used to be obese significantly. When I met Ryan.
That's hard to believe.
I know, right? I weighed about 90 pounds more than I weigh now.
And right now you weigh like 80.
I'm 6'2", about $170.
Wow.
And yeah, I used to just weigh a lot more, but it's exactly what you said. It was this ceaseless consumption. And I've noticed it most in our culture. It manifests in food, it manifests in stuff.
Yeah.
These are sort of a physical manifestation, though, of simply what's going on inside us. If you have a lot of physical clutter, there's a good chance that you have a lot of, as you said, spiritual clutter or mental clutter, emotional clutter, psychological clutter, relationship clutter, right, career clutter, all of these different types of clutter, everything that's going on inside us, it finds its way out into the real world around us. And so, in me personally, I was what I call an organized hoarder. I had those hundreds of thousands of items, but if you came to my home, they were sort of tucked away in bins and boxes and alphabetized systems, and so it looked organized. In fact, I think organizing is one of the most pernicious things in our culture because it hides the clutter, right? Organizing doesn't work. Here's another thing for you. Decluttering alone does not work because these things simply cover up symptoms. It's like putting a balm on an axe wound. And consumerism is an axe wound for us. It's driving us to behave in ways that are making us miserable. The objects of our desire, all the things we think we want, become the objects of our discontent.
Okay, it seems like part of the transition is being convinced that what you need are things to make you happy.
Right.
And then you get more and more and more things. So it would almost be logical to go, okay, if I'm not happy, maybe I'm pursuing the wrong things.
Sure.
Or maybe I need to figure out which of these things really matter to me or not. But you went to a fundamental place and said, it's not about figuring out which things, it's why things.
Oh, yeah. So what is the why behind the what? That's actually the reason I say decluttering doesn't work, right? Because if you were buying a bunch of things to make you happy and you're like, oh, crap, this didn't work. Well, I guess I'll just get rid of the things that will make me happy. Well, that's just the other side of the same continuum. Now, getting rid of the excess stuff does make room for some introspection. Start asking some deeper questions. Why have I been so discontented? What's truly important in my life? Who's the person I want to become? And how am I going to redefine what success is for me? Like, these are fundamental questions that we have to answer. And by the way, they're individual questions because the right answer for you could be the inappropriate answer for me. And so we have to figure them out on an individual level. I really wish there was a list. Like, I could publish a book with, Erwin, here's the 150 items. If you own them, you'll be happy. Your life will be complete. But of course, it doesn't work that way. The things that add value yesterday may not add value today. And that's not just things. It's relationships, it's activities, it's careers, it's everything else. If we're not constantly questioning the things we bring into our life and the things we hold on to, eventually it's gonna lead us to a path of discontent.
Because I think sometimes in the midst of that level of unhappiness, we can actually declutter from the wrong things.
Yes.
Because you went through a divorce, and that could have led you to decide it's just not worth the risk, that this is what's making me unhappy.
Yeah.
And yet I've met your amazing wife.
Yeah.
So you clearly realized that in the mix of that, it wasn't love that needed to be eliminated from your life.
No, it was the opposite in a way. Like, so love for me is seeing people for who they are without trying to change them. Unfortunately, when we get involved in a lot of relationships, the first thing we do is like, oh, they're great. If I could just change these 7 things about them. Well, that's not love. That's manipulation, right? And however, real love, can inspire people to change, which is really beautiful. My wife has changed me in ways that she never tried to change me, but she's inspired me to be the best version of myself. And how beautiful is that? Because, the alternative is being dragged in a direction I don't want to go and being miserable as a result.
So somewhere in between, you went from pursuing everything to then almost becoming an iconic figure for minimalism. Somewhere in between, there had to be a sifting process because now you have incredible success. You've become this voice. You have 2 Netflix documentaries.
Yeah.
You have a new book, Love People, Use Things. This is your 4th book?
Yes.
You, in any measure, you and Nick have become incredibly successful.
Right.
So ironically, you walked away from success, moving toward minimalism, and now you have probably more success than you had when you walked away.
Yeah,
right?
So as a minimalist, first off, I'll say this. Everything you do as a minimalist becomes blanketed by irony immediately because, you're not a minimalist, you wear underwear or whatever. And the success is different now because I was able to redefine success. I think traditional success is almost always failure because it's always some sort of chasing that makes us miserable. And so misery isn't success, but the things that we chase often make us miserable. Now it's not about a chase. Yes, the things that you talked about, they're sort of byproducts of living a more meaningful, intentional life.
It seems to me, looking from the outside in, that in the first part of your journey, you were pursuing things.
Yes.
And now in this part of this journey, things have just come to you.
Yeah.
As you've lived the life you determined to live.
Yeah, as soon as I started aligning my short-term actions with my long-term values, whereas before it was sort of, well, I didn't know what my long-term values were. And it was, I'm going to do what is going to make me feel good right now. In fact, I think it's one of the biggest problems in our society is we confuse pleasure with other higher forms of well-being. I'm not against pleasure. I enjoy pleasure, right? Especially when pleasure is a byproduct of something. But the pursuit of pleasure, which is what we're doing all the time now we have these pleasure machines in our pocket, right? And I can pull it out anytime. I can get affirmation. I can get dopamine hits immediately right here on this device. But that's not the same thing as happiness, and it's certainly not the same thing as like tranquility or joy. These higher order forms of well-being. And so the pursuit of pleasure is not a noble pursuit. But if I can find peace, if I can find equanimity, if I can find joy in my relationships with other people, pleasure tends to be a beautiful byproduct of that. And so does happiness.
All right. So as you began this new pursuit toward minimalism, was there ever a point where you thought, oh no, this might work, I may end up with nothing?
Truthfully, yes. When I started simplifying, although I'll tell you, when you have a lot of stuff, you begin letting go, it does feel freer and you feel lighter.
But you gave up your job.
I did.
You gave up your career. You gave up all the visible future you had.
Yeah, and I had a supposedly, at least ostensibly, successful career, right? And I managed hundreds of employees and hundreds of retail stores. And what I saw in that is I saw my path forward, because we always tell ourselves we're going to be different. Like, you know what? If I see my boss and his boss and the CEO and the CFO and whomever, and they're not very happy, but I'm going to be different. Well, if I follow the same recipe, I'm going to bake the same pie, right? And so I realized it was actually scarier for me to stay on the path I was in. And it was scary to leave too, because there's a lot of uncertainty there. But the certainty of misery was actually more scary for me than walking away from that. But back to the stuff, you talked about getting rid of the things. What I learned early on is it was not about getting rid of the things that are valuable. In fact, at one of our live events, someone came up afterward, and you could tell maybe a friend or a spouse brought them there to the event, and they were sort of dragged there, and they came up to the microphone and asked a question. And they said, it seems like you and Ryan, you guys did not get rid of anything important. And Ryan just looked over at the guy and he goes, yeah, that's right.
That's the whole point.
That's the point of this. And sometimes we have to temporarily deprive ourselves of something important to figure out whether or not it actually adds value to our life. So that's important. But what I will say is that as we are letting go, it's not about renouncing stuff. Because as soon as you, Anthony DeMello says, if you renounce something, you're forever tethered to it.
Yeah.
And so it's not about saying stuff is bad. No, I get immense value from stuff. Here's the paradox of minimalism. I get far more value from the fewer things I have now than if I were to water them down with thousands of useless trinkets.
So what's one thing you let go that you finally gave yourself permission going, no, this is actually brings meaning to my life?
Yeah.
Can you think of something?
Yeah. So there are quite a few things I've let go of. I wouldn't say I regret letting go of them, because if I do need something, I can always bring it back. That's the nice thing about letting go. It's sort of a superpower in a way, because my ability to let go, to be able to walk away from anything, doesn't mean I can't walk back to it if I want to. It may be a different item, physical item. And yes, there are some sentimental items that I let go of, especially when my mother passed, and I was sorting through her things. But the same thing there, I realized I could have kept 1,000 sentimental items. Yeah. But I wouldn't have gotten the same kind of value that if I would have held on to 5 of them. Now all of a sudden, I do get more meaning from those things. Not that the things have an inherent meaning in them, they don't. We impart some sort of meaning on it, and there's nothing wrong with that. We find certain things to be enjoyable, meaningful, they're amplifying, they're life-giving in a way. It's as long as those things aren't getting in the way. Now, is there anything in particular I'm like, oh, I really wish I wouldn't have gotten rid of that old baggy sweatshirt with tassels? No. I mean, letting go is so freeing that I don't ever regret it.
What I love about the way that you integrate this in your life is that you don't let the ideology of minimalism control your life. You use it to inform your life. And it's very, very different, because I think a lot of times when people become dogmatic, they become judgmental and tell everyone else, no, you should get rid of that, or you should get rid of that, rather than saying, you need to be informed by this so that you know what to get rid of. And no one can tell you that except yourself.
Right.
But I still want to dig in a little bit more, because I don't think you gave up your job going, I'm going to become a spokesperson for minimalism.
No, not at all.
So when did you realize, in a sense, that you were onto something?
Yes. It's fascinating. There were a few sort of moments along the way where I noticed some sort of shift. So I wrote fiction throughout my 20s. And so when I left the corporate world, I wanted to work at the coffee shop in my neighborhood, back in Dayton, Ohio. I got my bills down to essentially nothing. I had rent and utilities. I didn't even have internet at home, no TV, nothing. And because that freedom was so worth it to me, I was just going to work in a local coffee shop and write my fiction. And then the people around me, as I was still in the corporate world, sort of winding down there, they noticed this profound change in me. They said things like, you seem less stressed, or you seem so much calmer, what's going on with you? And I could tell they were asking about me, but they were really asking about them. Yeah. And then my best friend, Ryan Nicodemus, who I've known since we were fat little fifth graders together, we worked at the same corporation. And he came up to me and he said, why the heck are you so happy? And that was sort of staggering to me, because it opened the door. I never jumped up and said, look at me, I'm a minimalist. You need to be a minimalist too, right? You've got so much crap in your life and you should do this. No, it opened the door for me to talk about minimalism when he asked about that happiness. It's not that I was pursuing happiness. All of a sudden I was happier because I was letting go of the excess stuff in my life and making room for the things that made me happier. And so that was the first thing. And then he tried something really radical. He did this thing called a packing party, which you saw in our last film. And he pretended like he was moving. And so everything he owned, he just packed up. Because it's the one time we're all forced to confront all of our things. When you move, you have to pack everything in boxes. And it's a literal weight. And so he had to deal with that. And after he went through that whole experiment, he said, I think some people might find some value in this. And Josh, you've been writing for a while. How about we do a little website, we write just about this journey. And that's really where the Minimalists.com started, was with that 21-day packing party he did. And something amazing happened that first month. 52 people visited our website. And I know that does not sound remarkable at all, but to me, you had to think, throughout my 20s, the only people who read my stuff were people who were saying no to me, agents and publishers who were like, no. And now it was like, oh my gosh, 52 people are saying yes to me now. And those 52 people turned into 500 pretty quickly. They turned into 5,000 and 5 million, et cetera. Because when you find value in something, you tend to share it with your friends and family and loved ones, because you hope they'll find value in it as well. And so really right around then, that first year, when people started sharing these things that we were writing about, I knew that, maybe there's something more to this whole less thing.
All right, so you have a crisis.
Yes.
And it makes you rethink your life.
Yeah.
And you begin to let go of things.
Yeah.
But then you went from 50 to 500 to 5,000 to 5 million people whose lives you're influencing. What do you do to not replace things with likes and affirmation and influence? Like, do you find that tension there?
Yes, yeah, for sure. And especially in 2017, our first film, which is called Minimalism, came out on Netflix. It was a strange story because they actually turned us down twice. And so we put it out on our own. We did a theatrical thing, and we had a sizable audience at the time, but nothing like we have now. And part of that is because when this film hit Netflix, it created this conflagration and the message just spread. And I found for the first time where I realized how enticing that was. Let's try to replicate this. Let's pursue happiness. And I didn't realize that at the time, but what I want to do is, like, how can I do this again? I was like, well, you don't want to do this again. You've already done this. The better question I could have asked myself is, what is the next step? And because there's nothing wrong with attention. We all desire some sort of attention from certain people, but the needing of it tethers you to it. And all of a sudden, that's a particular kind of prison that you can put yourself in. And so finding a way to let go of that need as well. By the way, it's the same thing as with stuff. It's just a little bit more intricate, because anyone who's watching this could go home, rent a dumpster, throw all their stuff in it, and be miserable. Because you can let go of the stuff without letting go of the attachment to stuff. Letting go is not something you do. Letting go is something you stop doing. You stop clinging to the excess stuff. You stop clinging to toxic relationships. You stop clinging to the need of everyone else's approval. You stop clinging to the things you thought you needed to make you happy.
So I met your daughter, Ella.
Yes.
So how, as a dad,
Yeah.
do you begin to translate these principles of minimalism in her life in a way where she doesn't recoil or rebel against it because she feels like you're keeping things from her that she wants? I don't know if you ever have that tension.
Yes.
You know, how do you, how have you found the best way to translate some of these values in her life?
We have a mutual friend. His name's Rob Bell.
Oh, yeah.
And he once told me that you're always teaching your kids, and sometimes it's with words. And really, I can tell her till I'm blue in the face to eat her broccoli or not own too many possessions. But if she sees me behaving differently from what I'm saying, then of course she's going to mimic that behavior. We are meme machines in a way, especially as children. We soak up everything that's going on around us. And so the best thing I can do is not even try to change her or scorn her or shame her for her preferences. Yes, she loves purple balloons and she loves having all of these things, and I can tell her to love people and use things, but she says, I loved my stuffed animals though. And instead of saying, well, no, you're wrong about that, I just say, I understand. And because, man, it took me almost 40 years to get to where I am right now, right? And so all of a sudden, I don't expect an 8-year-old to figure this out overnight. Although I'll also say this, there's so much more wisdom in her than there is in my 28-year-old self from a dozen years ago. Because, it's funny that in her school, they do 15 minutes a day of mindfulness, right? Which at first seems neat. Like, oh, wow, we never got to do that in school. Then I'm thinking, well, how weird is that? That means you spend 6 hours and 45 minutes getting them out of their mind so that you can spend 15 minutes getting them back in. Kids are always mindful. They're always living in the moment. There's a particular wisdom in children. And so, in a way, I think it was Kapil Gupta who said, that adults are fools, children are wise. For children see something new every day. An adult hasn't seen a new thing in years. And so in a way, yes, she can learn from me, but I think the biggest thing I've learned is that I have a lot to learn from her.
That's so good. We were doing the sound check before we started this conversation, and everywhere we go, people say, hey, would you count whatever, and everyone always says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And when you did that, I had this thought in that moment. I said, I wonder why no one, when they go second, goes 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Instead of building on what someone else did, we always start from scratch ourselves.
Oh.
And when I had that thought this morning, I thought that's the power of legacy. When you realize your kids, they're not starting with 1, they're starting with 11.
That's
if
so
you
beautiful.
do it well.
Yes.
And I think that's the beauty that you can't even fully see how Ella will take the simplicity and beauty of this profound idea and reflect it in a way that maybe you could have never even imagined.
Yes. And so it's my job to not create a deficit there, because I don't want her starting at -20 or -100.
Right.
Because in a weird way, that's the place from which I started. My very first memory as a child is of my father extinguishing a cigarette on my mother's chest. I was 3 years old. And that creates a particular pattern. It also sets up like, oh, this is the home environment. Eventually we sort of escaped that, but we escaped to a life of a lot of struggle and poverty. And so, in a way, I was starting from a place of real lack. Our society has all these faux lacks all the time. Again, created by advertising, created by corporations, created by culture, society, etc., to to make us feel inadequate. But then there are places of real lack. And no, minimalism does not address you can't get rid of everything if you have a legitimate lack and still thrive. It's just understanding the lack that we think we have quite often is actually abundance.
Yeah. Well, it seems that to me that a part of when you're a child, everything's sort of a soup. You don't really divide between what is causing the pain or not causing the pain.
That's right.
And when there's emotional abuse and physical abuse and there's the absence of love and of safety.
Yes.
And then you attach all that to, and we're poor.
Yes.
Then you realize, then you go, the solution to all these things that cause me pain is to get rid of this, to not be poor.
Yes.
And you realize, no, actually, there are people who are economically challenged. They're poor, but they actually are loving and caring, and their kids aren't growing up with that deficit.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times what ends up happening is we attach what we really long for with the wrong thing. And we think, if I can turn that around, I'll turn everything around. Yes. But you could have become incredibly wealthy and been unkind and been abusive and been violent. You could have taken those attributes, taken them with you. Yeah. And you would have just been a guy with a lot more money, but the same problems.
In fact, money will amplify those problems. And so money itself is not inherently good or bad. It is merely a habit amplifier in a way.
And I know this is sort of a sidetrack around minimalism, but you found a way to create an internal process to get rid of things that did not bring you happiness.
Yeah.
But what was a part of the process to help you overcome all the pain and those early marks? Because a lot of times, kids who grew up in violence become violent. Kids who grew up in abuse become abusive. How did you, because just being around you, you're one of the kindest people I know.
Oh, thank you.
You have such graciousness and really compassion and tenderness. How did you, in a sense, break yourself free from that pattern to become the Joshua so many people know?
I think compassion, quite often we don't understand compassion. If you look at the Latin root of compassion, com and passus, it simply just means with suffering or in suffering. And so being with someone in their suffering doesn't mean you even have to feel their suffering. That's empathy. It's a different thing. We could talk about the virtues or non-virtues of that. But with respect to compassion and being caring or kind to other people, I found that there was sort of a roadmap to that, and I backed into this accidentally, but it really starts with tolerance, which is a weak virtue on its own. But sometimes it's like, instead of trying to change someone, maybe I can just step back and try to understand them. That's tolerance, right? It's a good first step, but it's not going to get you all the way there to compassion. So we use this acronym, it's TARA, T-A-R-A, tolerance, and then you move forward to acceptance. Like, okay, that person has different beliefs from me. That person has different interests, different hobbies, different desires, different values from me. Fine. I can accept that. I don't need to change them. The third leap is to respect. Respecting the fact that their values might be different from mine. And then finally, it's appreciation. If you're able to appreciate someone else, warts and all, not trying to force them or drag them in a direction they don't want to go. If you can appreciate that, then I think you can find real compassion.
That's so good. I agree 1,000%. I think one of the things that really confuses people sometimes of my approach even toward my faith is that I always look for things I can learn from every belief system, every philosophy, every religion. And people are used to creating us against them framework. And for us, it's always been the truth between us. Yes. Let's find the things that we hold in common. Let's find things that connect us and bring us together. And I love that framework. All right, we actually have a different view on something. And
Tell me about it.
I have a book coming out called The Genius of Jesus. And I have a chapter on empathy. And you basically say that empathy is really an overvalued virtue.
Yes.
So talk about that.
Yeah. So empathy, I think we often misunderstand. Usually what we mean when we say empathy is we mean compassion, being with someone when they're suffering. And if that's what you're talking about when you say empathy, not you personally, but anyone who uses this term empathy, I'm all for it. We could use a whole lot more compassion. However, there's a whole lot of science now that shows us that if we get too mired down in empathy, that is, again, you go to the Latin root of empathy, it means in suffering, right? Passus. Now, here's the thing about, or in feeling, really is what it means. But whenever you talk about empathy when someone is being really successful, right? No one says, oh, you just have to have empathy for Michael Jordan after he wins his 6th title. That's not what we're talking about. There's a different virtue we talk about there, something called compersion, feeling the joy of like your daughter or another loved one. And I think that's wonderful too. But if I go to a dentist who feels empathy for me, well, then if he really feels the same suffering I'm going through as he's drilling through my tooth, then man, that's probably not the dentist I want to visit. And so, while I'm not against empathy, I think disproportionate amounts of empathy can actually stall us from being our most compassionate self. So I'm not saying everyone should get rid of empathy. What I'm trying to understand is, what is the appropriate amount of empathy in this situation? Because I can't help but feel it. Right out here at the corner of La Brea and Hollywood, about a year ago, I saw someone get hit by a van. They were on their bike. They ran the light on their bike, got hit by a van. And I screamed out like I couldn't help it. Stop! Obviously, I couldn't stop it. That's real empathy, right? That paralyzes us to a certain extent, right? Now, of course, after he was hit and we made sure he was actually okay, his bike was destroyed. Thankfully, he was okay. The bike's replaceable. He's not. I had immense compassion for him and was able to be there for a moment with the suffering and realize like, oh, I don't want to feel his suffering, but I can try to understand it.
I mean, I agree completely about compassion in terms of it's all action. Like there's no compassion. There is no compassion without action. And I'll have to wait for you to read my chapter on empathy.
Okay.
And because I argue that empathy is the highest form of intelligence.
Oh, wow.
And, so we'll have a conversation in the future about that. It'll be fun.
I can't wait.
But I think that there are so many assessments around empathy that most of the time those assessments are judging how much your feelings are involved. And I'm going, that's actually not empathy. That's what our culture has turned into empathy.
Okay.
And where you've made me feel a certain way, and it's really about my feelings. It really isn't about caring about the other person's journey.
Sure.
And I think that's a part of the dynamic of the world we live in, where people are all about their feelings, but a lot of times they're not about other people's feelings and an awareness of how their actions affected other people.
Yes.
And it's when you saw your dad put out a cigarette on your mom's chest, it wasn't just the action that you saw. There was an impact, a psychological, emotional transference that happened in that moment.
Without a doubt.
And his lack of empathy, lack of concern about how his actions affect other people, actually created a really destructive narrative.
Yeah.
And as a husband and a dad, one of the things that people would ask me, I'm a lot older than you. I've lived this life quite a bit, and they ask me, how have you not made some self-destructive decisions in your life? I said, the more people you love, the less likely you are to make self-destructive decisions.
Yeah.
Because when you only love yourself, you don't really think through the consequences of your actions and how they affect other people.
That's right. It's only about how it affects me.
Yeah.
Me.
Yeah, and so, the moment I married Kim, she became a more important component of my decision-making.
Yeah.
And the moment Aaron and Mariah were born, they became a more valuable component to my decision-making than my own life. And I do see that in you too. And really, minimalism for you, it seems to me that you actually have a deep concern about how people are drowning in their own depression and unhappiness, pursuing the wrong things, and how they have almost been sold a lie.
Yes.
And I think because you have a chapter on truth.
Yes.
And which I think is so good because your title, Love People Use Things, is such elegant simplicity. Right? It's like it's 4 words that if you lived out would change everything in your life.
It's come to define our message. I remember in 2014, Ryan and I went on this book tour for our second book, a book called Everything That Remains. And we did 119 events in 100 cities. We basically spent a whole year of our life on the road. And it's not as glamorous as it sounds.
That was not minimal.
Well, we were sleeping some nights in his Toyota Corolla, so it was rather minimal.
Maybe crazy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we sold enough books in one night, we could maybe share a hotel room. But we learned so much from that. But at the end of one of the events, someone asked a question like, well, what do you hope to get out of this whole message? And I said, basically love people and use things because the opposite never works. And you could just see the light bulbs turn on over people's heads. And from there, I started ending the events with that. Yeah. And then we started a podcast, and we started ending the podcast with that phrase. And then people started tattooing that phrase on their arms and their legs, and people were putting on clothes, and churches were putting it up on their marquees. And I realized oh yeah, I've always known that this is bigger than me, but this one thing there's a whole book on it now, but you can say the whole book without even reading the whole book. It's right there in the title. It's just, if you want to dive deeper, then yeah, it's identifying these relationships in our life that get in the way of our most important relationships, which are these interpersonal relationships.
All right, so there's something really interesting to me here, because a lot of times when people hear a concept, they add to it their own already preconceived assumptions.
Yes.
So they go, oh, he's a minimalist, so he's just chilling.
Yeah.
How many events did you do?
119.
In how many days? In that 365 days?
Yeah, it's 10 months, yeah.
Sleeping in a car.
Sometimes, yeah.
So it would be fair to say you're incredibly driven.
Yes. Yeah.
So minimalism did not reduce your drive.
No, if anything, it focused it.
I think this is interesting because I think a lot of times when people see the genius of someone, they don't realize that there are layers that drive this person. You didn't come to minimalism to say, I just don't want to think about tomorrow, or I just don't want to have any drive or ambition, or I don't want to make a difference in the world. It seemed like it actually accelerated a fire inside of you.
Yes. Yeah.
Because before you were striving for success that I think drove you less than now this drive to bring meaning to the world.
In the Christian tradition, you may identify it as devotion in a way, and it feels much more like that than it does drive. There's a particular devotion to, whether you want to call it the truth or you want to call it freedom. That could be freedom from stuff, freedom from attachment, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a drive there. And also, there's a particular obsession in a way for me. And quite often we talk about obsession as a bad thing or unhealthy thing, right? And it certainly can be when we're obsessed about things that are making us miserable, right? But if we're devoted to something that is greater than us, it's affecting the joy of other people, or also easing the misery of other people, then that can be incredibly meaningful.
So I'm going to ask you a very superficial question.
Okay.
When you were on tour,
yes,
was it fun?
It was so fun. Yes. Yes.
Because I think this is another narrow distinction between minimalism and monasticism.
Yes.
And because you seem to me to be really enjoying your life.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a particular joy there, but it's also, it involves other people. And that's one thing that I learned just over the last decade or so is real joy. It's impossible to experience real joy on a deserted island by yourself. You could experience contentment or peace. In fact, you might get some real peace there.
Would you consider Maui a deserted island?
It's funny you say that. I was driving in LA the other day. I saw this brand new Lexus, and they had a license plate cover that said, happiness is being in Maui. And I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. But you're instead, slogging through traffic in LA. You aren't being in your happy place. You're here in your traffic in LA so you can pay for this car that keeps you in traffic in LA. And if that's happiness to you, then
move to Maui, take a lesser job, and enjoy your life.
You don't need the Lexus to be happy, right? And trust me, as someone who used to have two Lexuses, Lexi, I think, is the plural of it. And so, yes, fun is a part of it. Joy is certainly a part of it, but that joy comes from contributing beyond myself as well, and sort of that symbiosis of the relationship, the give and the take. Every sort of relationship, friend, family member, intimate relationship, has an us box in the middle. And I do get things from it, but I also want to be able to contribute to that us box more than I take.
That's so good. I think it's so important for people to realize that you are eliminating things to actually experience life more fully.
Yes.
And so in that sense, you have more of what matters because you have less of what doesn't matter.
Yes.
All right, so you would never call yourself a genius, but I am calling you one. And so if you had to identify the genius of Joshua Fields Millburn, what would it be?
I think we just talked a moment ago about the devotion thing, but I want to go deeper on the obsession thing. I mean, there's something there, this unnameable thing that you can call it drive, you can call it obsession, whatever it is. You know, some people are very curious, like widely curious, and I look at that and I find it really fascinating. But when I dive into something, I dive deep into it. I don't want just the Wikipedia page. I'll start there, but then I'll go to every reference on the Wikipedia page and read the books they're recommending about this spiritual figure or about this leader or about this topic, because I will dive deep. I'll get obsessed about the thing, not in a way that burns me out, but in a way that really fuels me or energizes me. And so I think if there is any sort of genius there, it has to do with this type of obsession where I will pick something up and it's always in the service of the greater good, though. It's not to serve just me. Don't get me wrong, it serves me as well. But my serving also serves me. So the question always is, does this serve the greater good? And that could be with respect to a tweet or a book that we publish or a film we put out. I'm not going to do it unless it serves the greater good. It can't serve just me.
Are there any historical figures that have inspired you? That if you had to identify the 1, 2, or 3 geniuses that really inspired you in history, who would they be?
Sure. I've mentioned a few here. Anthony DeMello's work, I think, is fascinating around awareness. When we think of modern day figures who are still alive, Kapil Gupta is a philosopher, a thinker, who is a very interesting. I call it inspirational fire and brimstone. And so you have to take it in small doses, but like there's a type of awareness there that really stands out to me. I go back to Jesus, I go back to the Buddha, and I look at sort of these wisdom traditions, and I wonder, wow, we tap into some truths, and sometimes we almost ruin them with language. There's Anthony DeMello says that meditation is merely silence, right? And so there's something about silence that also inspires me. The silence of these great thinkers. There's a particular genius in someone who's willing to be silent.
So with everyone who's listening right now and they're trying to work their way through the uncertainty of their life or the mess of their life or the clutter of their life, what would be your first steps for them to get to a new place, to a better place?
The first step is always the why, never the how. So you start with the question, and this question is actually disguised as a how. So the question I mentioned earlier, how might your life be better with less, is really a why question. But we are smitten with how-tos, and so we want the 7 steps for this and that and whatever. But really it starts with one step, understanding what the benefits of simplifying are for you, because they're different for everyone. For some people it's like, oh yeah, I want to reclaim my finances, I'm in too much debt. For other people, it's like, yeah, my house is so dirty and I just want it to be easier to clean. Okay, great. Some people are like, I want to walk away from my career and do something I'm really passionate about creatively. Wonderful. Whatever the benefits are for you, getting clear on that really gives you the momentum you need. Because as soon as you understand the why, the how takes care of itself. You don't need another video with the 67 decluttering tips on how to clean out your closet. We all know how to do that. But if we don't understand why we're letting go of the stuff, then that closet we just decluttered will be recluttered in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think of your title, Let People Use Things. Maybe it's even a great compass for how to make choices. How can the things you have that you don't need actually be an expression of love for someone else?
Yes.
This morning, when I came downstairs, Kim was already working. There's this homeless guy named Desmond that she's been helping, and she helped him get into a hotel, and she got this backpack filled with new clothes and things like that. And then today they're trying to help him find long-term housing, and she does this all the time. But she said to me last night, what size shoes do you wear? Here I've been married almost 40 years. She doesn't even know what size shoe I wear. And I said 11s. And unfortunately, my shoe was exactly the size she needed. And she goes, great, Desmond's an 11. Can you give me a pair of your shoes in the morning? So I'm about to leave. And all of a sudden I remembered. So I went upstairs and I just looked and had this pair of shoes. And, my first thought is, what are the oldest, pair of shoes I don't want in any way? But I saw this pair of shoes, and I think I've only worn them once or twice, and I knew that they would fit in one, so I took them downstairs, and I had this thought as I was giving her the shoes, and she said thanks, and I said that giving those shoes cost me nothing. I won't even remember in a week that I had those shoes.
That's right.
And yet there's still that little feeling of, gosh, I'm giving something up that's mine.
Yes.
And then there's almost like this exhilaration afterwards. Wow, I just gave up something that was mine.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we try to think of like generosity as something out there, but I think a lot of times giving something that actually is yours matters more.
Yes.
And I design clothes.
Yeah.
And what I find sometimes is that if I give someone something that I brought from like my shop, it means less to them than if I'm wearing it and they say, I really like that, and I take it off and I give it to them.
Wow.
And you would think the new thing would mean more to them.
Right.
But it's actually when you give them the shirt off your back,
yes,
that means more to a person.
Right.
And maybe a part of the process of loving people and using things is realizing, okay, if I have, what is it, how many thousands?
300,000.
300,000 things in my house. Let's say maybe 100,000 of them I don't need. That you could actually fulfill both of these principles at the same time by taking the things you have and using them as a way to loving the people that you have.
Your willingness to let go is a way to contribute to other people.
Yeah.
Because some of those things that you have aren't serving you, but that doesn't mean they won't serve someone else, right? And maybe they served you at one point. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be nice if they could serve someone else again?
Mm-hmm. It would be. I love when someone not only comes up with a brilliant idea, but they become a physical manifestation of that idea. And that is who you are, Joshua. And one of the reasons I admire you is because you live out what you preach.
Thank you.
And not only that, but you actually make people thirsty for living this kind of life.
Right.
Because if it was just about getting rid of stuff, I don't know how many people you would convince.
Yeah.
But when people get around you, they realize, wow, he's like living life the way I want to live it. He's experiencing joy and fulfillment and meaningful relationships. And somehow he's been able to wade through the confusion of all the stuff that lies to us about what brings us joy to find the things that really matter in life.
Yeah.
And long after you have left this earth, the story of your life and the message you're communicating is going to be making a positive impact on people's lives.
That's beautiful.
So I want to thank you for your genius and for being on this podcast with me.
I'm grateful for you. I love you, brother.
Hey, love you too. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me on the Genius of podcast. I want to encourage you to pick up Joshua's book, Love People, Use Things, and also go on Netflix and watch his 2 documentaries. I also want to encourage you to pick up my book, The Genius of Jesus, releasing September 14th. And if you're listening right now, I want to encourage you to go and leave a comment or let us know how these conversations are affecting your life. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can leave a comment. And I just want to encourage you to dive into these stories, because every hero has an origin story. And behind every genius, there's an unwrapping that can help us discover the genius within each one of us.